Now, prisoner realignment, Assembly Bill 109. That's the hashtag for Governor Jerry Brown's program to get the state to comply with a mandate from the courts, and that includes the U.S. Supreme Court, to reduce overcrowding in the state's prisons. The states now are sending some less serious offenders to the counties to finish up their sentences, and also giving the counties responsibility to handle their parole. About 16 months or so later, how's the program working? And what about complaints from some lawmen who claim the program's contributing to a spike in crimes? Well, joining me, Charis Kubrin, Charis as in Charlotte, Charis Kubrin, professor of criminology at UC Irvine, and the former district attorney of LA County, Steve Cooley. And welcome to both of you. Charis, you are no Charles, you are Charis.
I am definitely not.
But before we get going on this, just to kind of lay it out, how many prisoners are there in state prisons, and what do we have to get it down to, and where are we in that process?
Yeah, that's a good question, and it's important to get the context here. So California prisons, state prisons, are designed to hold a maximum of about 80,000 prisoners. And at our peak in 2006, we held about 173,000.
So more than double.
More than double. And when the Supreme Court came in and ruled in Brown v. Plata, the decision was that we needed to reduce prison population to 137% of capacity, or about 33,000 inmates by 2013 this year.
Reduce it by 33,000.
Yes.
Okay. All right, and so that's what we're doing now.
That was the charge,
All
right? And that's what we're in the process of doing.
So Steve, how's it working out?
Well, I think the evidence so far is pretty much anecdotal, but I think it's working out as some of us predicted early on, that it is a criminal justice nightmare and going to be a public safety disaster. Anecdotal evidence from throughout the state of California compiled by the Criminal Justice Legal Foundation indicates that it is crime is increasing, and the infrastructure in terms of local county jails is woefully inadequate to handle the new workload of incarcerated individuals. What happens is in these so-called non-serious, non-violent offenses, a judge announces a state prison sentence. You are going to state prison. Probation is denied. 8 years, 10 years, 20 years, 3 years. But the jails do not have the capacity. That's true here in Orange County. It's true in Los Angeles County. It's true in San Bernardino County. It's true in probably most counties throughout California. They cannot handle
So what's happening? I mean, are literally prisoners being moved and they're just being let go? I mean, what's happening?
Well, sort of a trickle-down effect. Anyone sentenced to county jail, at least in Los Angeles, for a misdemeanor or as a condition of felony probation, are not doing any time at all, effectively. To make room for the individuals who are being sentenced to quote-unquote state prison, but have to serve their time in the county jail. And it's just going to build on itself until, at least in Los Angeles County and probably other counties, the sheriffs are going to be early releasing individuals, putting them on some sort of house arrest or maybe a GPS device. And we all know from Sunday's article in the LA Times, that's not working. Thousands of parolees, sex offenders, are dumping their GPS devices. So we're moving towards what I predicted back when AB 109 was first proposed. We're moving towards disaster, a public safety disaster.
Charis, are we moving toward a disaster?
Well, I think it's way too soon to make that sort of assessment. The key point that was raised by Mr. Cooley, I think, is the fact that we have anecdotal evidence at this point. And as a social scientist, I get very concerned when we draw grand conclusions from what is in fact anecdotal evidence. There has not been one official correct policy evaluation of realignment, especially concerning its impact on crime rates. So to simply say realignment went into effect, crime rates went up or down, absolutely tells us nothing about whether realignment is causing crime to go up or down.
Right now the evidence is anecdotal. What, may take another year before we get some hard data? Or
yes, and I think part of the issue is that looking at crime rates generally, whether they go up or down and then linking it back to the program is problematic, in part because those crime rates don't tell us who's actually committing the crime. Are these realigned offenders that are committing the crime, or are crime rates going up for other reasons, perhaps related to the economy or housing and foreclosures or other kinds of factors that are occurring simultaneous with realignment?
Okay, well, what about the argument that Steve, I think if I hear him correctly, that what's happened now is because these, the county jails are kind of crowded too, and so you're bringing in these state prisoners, and so now you're releasing the people that were in the county jail, petty thieves or whatever they might be, and that they're out committing crimes.
Right. Now, there are some individuals who will be released sooner than normal, but I don't think that's across the board the case. First of all, we're at a historic moment here when counties themselves are getting the opportunity to define how to deal with these returning offenders. And what that means is that the counties can use the state funds to determine how best to serve their communities. If that involves building more jail space, beds in jail space, great. If that involves producing better rehabilitation programs for ex-offenders going back into the community, great. If that means beefing up their probation programs, great. But there's not really one uniform outcome here. There's lots of different things going on.
Steve, what about that? You know, these the local law enforcement people, stop your whining. You're getting money from the state, and you know, take some control of this and make it work.
First of all, local law enforcement is not getting much money from the state. $20 million total was allocated to all frontline law enforcement in California. That's 79,000, 80,000 peace officers throughout California. They're going to divvy up $20 million. That's chump change. So they're not getting it. It's going to sheriff's departments and probation to come up with and support maybe outside vendor rehabilitation programs. I think that what Jerry Brown and his friends in the legislature did with AB 109, or didn't do, was they didn't talk to some real law enforcement professionals to see what is the likely outcome of this. Do you have the resources? They also didn't know or didn't evaluate the fact that the counties in many instances were already doing a very good job in terms of identifying those that could be rehabilitated instead of going to state prison, should go to drug court instead of going to state prison, should explore other alternatives instead of going to state prison. We already had a pretty good system in the context of the determinate sentence law, and now they're sort of saying, oh, we're going to throw more money at you, now build a new and bigger system. We were doing a lot of things right. They just want to unload a population of people the judges determined belong in state prison onto somebody else because they had a budget problem and they had a Supreme Court case problem.
This sounds scary. I mean, should people be worried? Should we be worried that you know, we're not as safe as we were before this?
Yes.
Absolutely not. First of all, I'd like to go back to something that Mr. Cooley said, which is that we were doing a lot of things right. And I'd like to differ with that assessment. We had more people in prison than any other state in the United States. We've now been surpassed by Texas, but other than that, we were the leaders. We were #1, and that exceptionalism, I think, is something that California should not be proud of. Well, but not only that, in addition to having the highest incarceration rate, we had the highest recidivism rate, close to 70%. So it was, in fact, for these reasons that something drastic needed to be done, not simply just adding to what we were already doing by giving a little bit more money to the programs that were existing. Rehabilitation programs in California state prisons had been slashed for the last 15 to 20 years. And the result of that is inmates that get out of prison with absolutely no skills and abilities to reintegrate back into their communities. What we're saying now is the states couldn't do it. Let's see if the counties can achieve that better.
Okay, and so far, what are you seeing? I mean, are they it sounds like from what Steve's saying, they aren't achieving it. They aren't handling it.
I will go back to my original point that I stressed here is that we don't know. We simply do not know. Looking at what's going on with crime rates in some areas simply does not tell us whether a policy is working or not.
Do you think that there are some prisoners, people that shouldn't be in prison that are? For example, I know there are some people who think our drug laws are too tough. There's too many people who are just drug users and they shouldn't be in jail. I mean, is that a way to address this problem?
What I think we need to realize is that a one-size-fits-all approach did not work in California. That is, incarcerate. We cannot incarcerate our way out of a crime problem. We absolutely have to find solutions that work. That means we need to draw on evidence that we have from criminologists and other social scientists about the role of reintegration back into communities, from public health scholars about prevention. We need to find alternatives to incarceration.
Well, Steve comes at this as a lawman. You're a professor. Do you talk to police chiefs, to cops? I mean, what are they telling you?
Absolutely.
Probation officials?
Absolutely. So when I first moved here to California 2 years ago, I just got introduced to this realignment concept, and I was shocked to hear about it and what was going on. This is literally the biggest prison downsizing experiment in the country. The implications are vast. I wanted to learn as much as I could. And so I began talking to all kinds of individuals about their thoughts about it, et cetera. It's time we move from these public discussions to scientific evidence about its impacts. My colleagues and I have several grants in order to get funding to evaluate using proper data whether realignment will cause crime rates to go up or possibly down. There's reasons to suggest realignment may actually cause crime rates to go down. I mean, that sounds probably to some as a scenario that could never happen, but in fact, if you sit and think about it, there's good reasons for that.
Okay, Steve, finally, you know, given that this is the situation California's now in, what would you recommend?
Well, if I were king, it would be repeal. You repeal bad laws. That's not realistic in this environment, so this one's going to be studied and modified as best law enforcement professionals can. It's been amended 3 times. It was poorly drafted initially. There's been efforts to clean it up, add certain crimes back in there. I do want to make one point. Yes, we did have the highest recidivism rate, a very high recidivism rate, which is when you take a look at that, that just means parole agents are identifying people on parole who are committing new offenses or not abiding by the terms of their parole. So a high recidivism rate just means they're doing a good job. But the most important thing, before realignment started, we had the lowest crime rate in 60 years. I've been around long enough to remember the late 70s, early 80s, and the late 80s, early 90s, when LA City was the murder capital of the United States of America. Crime rate was through the roof. And so I have a little institutional memory here. We achieved the lowest crime rate in 60 years. AB 109, so-called realignment, is going to unwind that. That's my prediction, and we'll see what happens.
Okay, well, we will bookmark this show and revisit this when there's a little more data to see whether it's a disaster or something that's actually going to reduce the crime rate potentially. Okay, listen, something else I wanted to ask both of you because you both have perspectives on this. The recent Chris Dorner murder rampage, 4 people killed, 2 law enforcement officers, 3 more law enforcement officers injured. He's finally chased to the cabin in Big Bear and burned to death, or burned, and he apparently committed suicide. You know, this horrific thing, so many questions. One thing I wanted to ask you, Steve, is did the LAPD, their behavior in this, what kind of a grade would you give them? There was that one situation where they fired on a car with 2 women mail carriers in the morning. They seem jumpy. Is this to be expected, or do you expect more professionalism from law enforcement?
I don't know the exact situation, the facts those officers confronted. Apparently the car was similar. The car was driving by with its lights out. There were direct threats against this particular target. The vehicle driven by the newspaper delivery ladies was very similar to the one that Dorner was believed to be occupied. I'm not going to second guess them. Obviously, it should be investigated. Anytime there's an officer-involved shooting in Los Angeles County, it is investigated not just by law enforcement, but by the DA's office independently to determine the overall facts of the situation. But here you have a madman, literally, someone bent on revenge, who had already killed some people, executed them, and had sworn to get others. This was a real challenge to law enforcement when they had to defend so many potential targets. So, and I think that the element out there that's sort of elevating Dorner into some sort of a cause is not thinking about the mayhem and the slaughter and the killing of innocent people and law enforcement officers, and they want to enter into some sort of intellectual debate about whether he was treated right at an administrative hearing. Well, first-degree murder, execution murders are not the way you handle your grievances when you don't win.
What do you think about LAPD, though, saying now they're going to review some of these cases of dismissed cops?
I think postmortems are excellent. Anytime you have a situation where you could look at something, study it, reach out to others in other venues and try to say, did we do everything we should do here? Is there room for improvement? That's fine. That's being a professional, and that's being transparent, and I commend Chief Beck and the LAPD if they do follow through on that.
Charis, your thoughts on this phenomenon, and perhaps especially the social phenomenon of some people sympathizing with Dorner's racism charges.
Well, it's nice to be able to talk about this now a few weeks out, because I think right after something like this happens, we're still so raw from the emotion. that something like this can happen and how it impacts people. So I think it's important, once that raw emotion goes away, to then try and take a more analytical approach to what had happened. For me as a social scientist, what I like to emphasize is the importance of kind of the bigger picture and the context within which this particular mass shooting, but other mass shootings have occurred as well. And I teach a homicide and suicide class right now at UC Irvine. Okay, and one of the things I like to remind my students as we talk about this, as tragic as it is, that this really represents a very small percentage of all killings in the U.S.
All right, thank you. You get the last word, Charis. You can watch this show and past shows by going to pbssocal.org and clicking on SoCal Insider. My illuminating guests have been Charis Kubrin and Steve Cooley, and a special thanks to Kevin James, and thank you for watching. I'll see you again on SoCal Insider.